He had never lost a battle, not once, not in 40 battles, not against the greatest armies of his age. The Persians called him a demon. The Byzantines called him unstoppable. His own men called him the sword of God. Not as a compliment they invented, but as a title the prophet himself had given him. His name was Khalid ibn al-Walid, and in the spring of 634 AD, he was about to do something that military historians would study for the next 14 centuries. He was going to take Damascus, not by luck, not by overwhelming numbers, not by waiting for the city to starve. He was going to take it the way he took everything, by seeing what other commanders could not see, moving faster than anyone believed possible, and making decisions in real time that should have taken weeks of planning. But before we get to the siege, you need to understand what Damascus was. Damascus was not just a city, it was the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. A place where civilizations had been born and buried for 4,000 years before Khalid arrived at its gates. Greeks had ruled it. Romans had built it into one of the jewels of their Eastern Empire. The Byzantines had transformed it into a fortified Christian city of extraordinary wealth and strategic importance. Its walls were thick. Its garrison was professional. Its location, sitting at the edge of the Syrian desert with the anti-Lebanon mountains at its back, made it one of the most defensible positions in the entire region. Every previous conqueror who had taken Damascus had done so through years of pressure, political maneuvering, or sheer numerical advantage. Khalid had none of those luxuries. What he had was time, very little of it, and a mind that operated differently from every other commander of his era. The Islamic expansion that had begun under the Prophet Muhammad was still in its earliest years. The Arabian Peninsula had been unified, but the great empires to the north, the Byzantine Romans and the Sassanid Persians, had barely been touched. That was changing. In 634, the Caliph Abu Bakr sent armies north into the Byzantine territories of Syria and Palestine. These were not small raids. They were coordinated campaigns designed to test whether the momentum of the early Islamic State could extend beyond Arabia. Khalid was already fighting in Iraq against the Persians when the order came. What happened next became one of the most celebrated marches in military history. Khalid took roughly 9,000 men and crossed the Syrian desert. Not around it, through it. The route he chose was considered impassable. No army had crossed it in living memory. There were no reliable water sources. The heat was lethal. The distances were enormous. Khalid had his soldiers carry extra water in the stomachs of camels, a technique so unconventional that it had never been tried at that scale before. He calculated the march down to the last hour. He pushed his men at a pace that should have destroyed them. They crossed the desert in 6 days. 6 days. Moments like this are why history isn't boring. It's unbelievable. If you're enjoying this, drop a like, so more people can discover stories like this. When they emerged on the other side, the Byzantine commanders in Syria had no idea he was coming. He appeared from the direction no army was ever supposed to come from. And before the Byzantines could regroup, he had already fought and won 3 engagements. By the time Khalid reached Damascus, the situation had developed a complexity that would have paralyzed most commanders. The city was defended by a substantial Byzantine garrison. The surrounding region was filled with Byzantine forces that had not yet been defeated. More reinforcements were potentially coming from the north, from Antioch, from Constantinople itself. Khalid could not simply lay siege in the traditional sense. A conventional siege meant staying in one place, and staying in one place with Byzantine forces on multiple sides meant risking encirclement himself. He had to do something different. What he designed was not a siege in the classical sense. It was a simultaneous encirclement and mobile defense, a structure that had never been attempted at this scale before. He divided his army, not weakened it. Divided it into self-sufficient units, each positioned at one of Damascus's gates, each capable of independent action, each connected to the others through a system of rapid communication that Khalid personally managed. The city had 7 gates. Khalid covered all 7. Each unit was commanded by one of his most trusted officers, Abu Ubaidah at the Jabiya gate, Shirabul ibn Hassana at the Thomas Gate, Amr ibn Alas to the south, and Khalid himself positioned at what he had identified as the critical point, the East Gate, closest to the potential direction of Byzantine relief forces. He was not just besieging Damascus, he was simultaneously watching every road into Syria, ready to break off and intercept any Byzantine force that tried to relieve the city before it fell. It was a single commander managing two operations at once, the siege and the mobile defense in real time across a front that stretched for miles. Inside Damascus, the population watched and waited. The Byzantine garrison commander, a general named Thomas, who was reportedly the son-in-law of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius himself, understood the threat but could not fully answer it. Thomas was not incompetent. He organized sorties from multiple gates to test Khalid's positions. He sent urgent messages to Heraclius requesting relief forces. He tried to exploit the gaps between the besieging units. Every sortie was repulsed. The relief messages reached Heraclius. The emperor, dealing with simultaneous crises across his empire, could not respond quickly enough, and Khalid waited, patient in a way that his battlefield ferocity never suggested he could be, watching, calculating, not attacking until the moment was exactly right. That moment came on a night in September 634. Inside Damascus, something happened that Khalid had not planned, but was prepared to exploit with terrifying speed. A child was born to one of the city's noblemen. In celebration, the garrison relaxed. Wine flowed. The soldiers at the East Gate, Khalid's gate, became less vigilant than they should have been. A civilian inside the city, either sympathetic to the besiegers or simply sensing an opportunity, sent a message out through the walls. The guard is down at the East Gate. Khalid received the message in the middle of the night. He did not wait for dawn. He did not call a council of war. He did not send scouts to verify. He acted. Within minutes he had assembled a force, had ladders placed silently against the East Gate wall, and had his men climbing before the garrison inside understood what was happening. He was over the wall before the alarm was raised. By the time the garrison mobilized, Khalid's forces were inside the city, fighting their way toward the main gate to open it from within. The fighting inside Damascus was brutal and close. Street by street, building by building. The kind of combat that destroys formations and tests individual soldiers rather than commanders. Khalid was in the middle of it, not directing from the rear, fighting at the front, personally, the way he always fought, leading from the place of greatest danger, making real-time decisions that no messenger system could have handled fast enough. Meanwhile, something equally remarkable was happening on the other side of the city. Abu Ubaidah, commanding the forces at the Jabia Gate on the western side, had received a message of surrender from Damascus's civilian leadership, the Christian bishop and the merchant elders, who understood that further resistance would mean the complete destruction of the city. Abu Ubaidah accepted the surrender terms immediately, without waiting for Khalid. The terms were generous by the standards of the age: lives protected, property respected, churches untouched, freedom of worship guaranteed, a fixed tax in exchange for the full protection of the Islamic State. Damascus had surrendered from the west at exactly the moment it was being taken by force from the east. Khalid, fighting his way through the eastern streets, and Abu Ubaidah, accepting terms at the western gate, reached the center of the city at almost exactly the same time. The commanders looked at each other across the central forum of Damascus. The city was theirs. What happened next showed something about Khalid that the battlefield stories alone cannot capture. When he learned that Abu Ubaidah had granted surrender terms to the western half of the city, he accepted it completely. No argument, no insistence that the military victory trumped a diplomatic agreement. The terms Abu Ubaidah had given would apply to the entire city, because Khalid understood something that purely tactical commanders never learn. Taking a city is one thing, governing what you have taken is another. And Abu Ubaidah's terms made Damascus a functioning, productive part of the new order, rather than a shattered ruin full of resentful survivors. Damascus fell in September 634. It was the beginning of something that neither side fully understood in that moment. Within 4 years, the Byzantines would lose all of Syria. Within 7 years, Egypt would fall. Within a century, the Islamic world would stretch from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of China. Damascus would become one of the great capitals of that world, not despite the terms of its surrender, but because of them. The Umayyad Caliphate would make it its imperial capital. The city that Khalid had taken in a night raid would become the center of an empire larger than Rome at its peak. And Khalid ibn al-Walid, he would go on to fight more battles, win more campaigns, extend the frontier further north, further east, further into territories that had seemed permanently beyond reach. He was eventually relieved of command by the Caliph Umar, not for losing, but because his victories were becoming so complete, his reputation so overwhelming. The soldiers were beginning to believe the victories came from Khalid rather than from God. He died in bed, in Homs, a warrior who had never been defeated in battle, dying not on a battlefield but of age, surrounded by the scars of every wound he had ever taken, and grieving, reportedly, that he had not been granted the death he had spent his entire life seeking. His last words, according to tradition, were a soldier's lament that he had fought in so many battles, been wounded so many times, and yet here he was, dying in bed like an old man. The sword of God, undefeated, unbowed, the man who took Damascus in a single night. And if you want to see what happens when a different kind of unstoppable force meets the one wall it cannot break, watch our video on the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, because what happened there will show you the other side of the story. The link is on screen now.